afternoon, everyone. We have got an hour together this afternoon to have a talk about the regulatory standards that we're now working under. So I've got to show you a couple of slides first to make sure you know who's talking to you about this. Me. But also to let you know that I'm standing here today representing myself, not representing the regulator, okay? Although we do have Kathy down the back, so we can throw some questions to her if we need to. So now she just wants to kill me. All right, so I have chosen this title for a very particular reason. So we have worked with regulatory standards in our sector for many, many years now, and it just so happens on 6th of April we got a new set. And a lot of people are going, well, you know, it's all new, it's different, it's this, it's that, but I want to ask you, really, is it that different? Are we in a new world, a new reality, or are we working with a refinement of what we already know? And I would actually like to suggest to you that we're working with a refinement of what we already know. Within those standards, there's conceptually nothing new in there. All the concepts that we've always worked with are still there. What we do have is we do have a new degree of specification around some of those things. So, you know, my hope is in saying that is that sometimes these things can be quite scary when you think about all of the policies and processes and forms and bits of paper that exist in your organisation and the thought of reviewing all of those things. In fact, if we look at it quite logically, then there's a lot there that is actually common. Of course, what is different for us here in Western Australia and those of us who are regulated by TAC is we're now working with a piece of legislation when we're talking about our standards. Those of you who have been working with ASQA, you're used to that already. So if we have a look at these standards, we now have eight standards. And I've grouped them like that as they have been grouped in the piece of legislation into 3 sections. And for those of us who think back to the AQTF and we think about that we had a standard that was about training and assessment, we still have a group of standards that are about training and assessment, standards 1, 2 and 3. We had standard 2, which was about your service to your clients, and we still have that in 4, 5 and 6. And we had a standard that was about the way we ran our RTOs, and we still have that in standards 7 and 8. We do have, though, within those standards, all of these clauses, and that's where the specification lies. And you know, they always say the devil's in the detail, and it is in the detail here. As you can see, standard 1's got 27 clauses in it. It's a bit of a monster standard, and it's the one where the majority of focus around the training and assessment actually sits. So why did they need to do this to us? Why did they need to do this to us? Really, it was about trying to reduce unnecessary regulation. And that's not necessarily about the standards itself, it's about what the regulators can do with the information that they get about the standards. So if we've got a really clear set of standards where they tell us what to do, we can get some data, the regulators can get data, then they can implement a risk-based approach. And when they implement a risk-based approach, it means that they can focus their regulatory efforts where it's most needed. So if you're a wicked RTO, and you've been very naughty, then we might be coming to see you a little more frequently than if you're an RTO who is consistently compliant and you've got a great record, then the idea is that we can leave you alone as much as possible. So that idea is echoed in this idea of earned autonomy, where some of the regulatory functions can actually be transferred through to the RTOs themselves. So things such as managing your scope is something that could be transferred through to you, and both the regulators, well, ASQA is already doing it, TAC is in the process of doing it, and the VRQA will make a decision whenever they make a decision about that. The idea was that we would have some clear standards that we could interpret consistently, and that's not only RTOs interpreting those standards consistently, but the regulators themselves interpreting those standards consistently. And TAC and ASQA have certainly been working together on coming up with consistent approaches to how those audits will happen and the kinds of things that would be looked at. But most importantly, it's really about confidence in the community, in the qualifications that we issue them out of our RTOs. It's probably pretty fair to say at the moment that our reputation has taken a few hits lately in terms of the qualifications that we issue. So let's look at where the change in specification really lies. So some of these I'm just going to talk to generally, and a couple of them we're going to talk to in a bit more detail. So firstly, we'll have a look at the TAE qualification. This is a qualification that underpins our sector. Okay, we all need to hold this qualification, or now we have a little bit of choice in that we might be able to have a higher level qualification in adult education. But this is the bedrock qualification that enables us to learn how to function in the sector. And some organisations offer fabulous TAE qualifications. Others, you know, I've met people in my role where I talk to them about units of competence and they don't know what I'm talking about. So we do have a few issues around the TAE, and so as a result there's a higher degree of specification in there about who can actually deliver that qualification and its need to be independently validated. So they're putting some more controls around that qualification that is so important to us in the sector. The other thing that's changing with that qualification is each of us as a trainer and assessor, when it comes to the TA, we always used to be able to hold it or prove equivalence to it. Well, from the 1st of January next year, that proving equivalence disappears. So at the 1st of January, we're either looking to have that TAE qualification or we're looking to have that higher level qualification in adult education. So that's really what's different there. Amount of training is different. It's one of the ones I want to leave and come back to and talk to in a little bit more detail. There's a real focus on the RTO's practice, and that's fantastic. So I can't tell you the number of times I've had people give me a piece of paper and say, is this compliant? Well, you know, a piece of paper doesn't make you compliant. How you use it, what you do with it, what it translates to in practice is what makes you compliant. So these standards now talk about your systems and your processes and your practice. So we need to be 100% sure that what you're doing actually works for the client groups that you are working with. And your practice is going to be unique to you. You have your own set of clients, you have your own organisational structure, you've got your own organisational culture. How you operate and what works for your group is what we are looking for. So we want to know that what you do works. Validation is one of the ones I'm going to come back to. We get a lot of questions about that one. There's a lot of focus on protecting the learner's rights in these new standards. There's a couple of standards in particular where they've got some really, really specific guidance about the kind of information that you put into your marketing materials, what kind of information has to be provided to the learners before they choose to engage with you as an RTO. The idea is that if you put out there accurately what it is you do and what it is you're offering to those RTOs, then they can make an informed decision about whether you're the right RTO for them. And there could be a whole lot of reasons why they choose not to go with you, but to go with somebody else. So it's about accurate, clear information for the client group that you are offering to. There's a big focus on partnerships and brokering in there. So we have within our sector a lot of arrangements where a whole lot of different parts of what you do as an RTO are actually contracted out to other people to do. And unfortunately, sometimes in those circumstances, what happens is when you contract something out, all of a sudden there's this feeling that it's not your responsibility anymore. And of course, it always is. So these new standards where you look at contracting out parts of what you do, including training and assessment functions, could be support functions, could be marketing functions, could be all kinds of things that you do, that in fact the regulators know about those arrangements that you have in place, and those arrangements are subject to audit. So the idea is to put focus on it within your minds so that you make sure that whatever arrangement you've put in place does work, and that those people who are performing those functions for you do so in the way that you want them to and that you need them to. And finally, training. Training gets a mention in these new standards. So, you know, we have always had a system that is very, very focused on assessment. You know, it's the whole idea of competency-based assessment is that we look for that outcome. How people get to that outcome could happen in any number of ways, one of which might be training. Just so happens that we work in a sector where a lot of our RTOs are in fact learning and assessment. So we do a lot of training as well as providing assessment functions. So we now have a number of standards that say you have to take into consideration how you're actually going to teach people when you are putting your strategies together, when you're looking at the kinds of resources that you might need to use to enable that, and when you're actually looking at your practice. So we actually have standards that say training and assessment practice, which is fabulous. It means we can have a look at those things. So there's nothing up there that is actually really different to what we have already known and talked about. It is simply that there is more specification around those things. We have, in my opinion, an enormous opportunity within our sector to think about how the systems and processes within our organisations actually drive quality training and assessment practices and client services. I see almost on a daily basis organisations doing things within their RTOs because they think they have to for compliance purposes that make no sense. I'm continually gobsmacked by some of the things that people do in their RTOs. And when I ask them, why are you doing that? They go, because I have to be compliant. And I go, really? I know these standards inside out and I can't find it anywhere in the standards where it says you have to do this. And, you know, typically it's been some little bit of gossip or propaganda that's sat out there on the grapevine, you know, where people have, you know, taken a little bit of information and it's become a bit of a monster for them. These changes really enable you to have a good look at what you do, and that's what I would be encouraging you to do, is to think about your training and assessment practices. Think about how it is that you do this and meet these needs of your client groups, and think about that first. Don't even look at the standards. Think about that first. And once you start to look at those key processes about how you service the clients that come to your organisation, and you've figured out what it is you do, then you can go back to the standards and say, do these things really address what's in the standards? And my guess is that probably 95 times out of 100 your answer is going to be yes, they will. Because if you think about quality training and assessment, if you think about fairness as a provider of a service, you think about it from a consumer's point of view, then you will actually address those requirements that sit in those standards. So think about it strategically. It's an opportunity for you to streamline, get rid of those bits of paper that you have no real purpose for. I've been in organisations where I've seen whole compactuses of paper. And they say to me, "Oh, we've kept these for you to look at." I go, "Oh, well, thank you for that, but not really a paperwork fan." And you know, when you really ask people, what do you do with this? What's the purpose? What does it add to your business? It doesn't add anything. It's a piece of paper for paper's sake. So typically, when you have these new standards come in, it generates some kind of review. And I'm sure within all of your organisations, you've probably got someone who's going, what do I have to change for these new standards? And typically, the bigger your organisation is, the more people you've got working on that project. But this is an opportunity for them to really look critically at how you operate, at what you do, and ask that question whether what you're doing adds value. So, you can ask me questions, by the way, if you want to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll wrap it on. Let's go back and have a look at a couple of these things that, I don't know if I want to use the word contentious, but that might be a reasonable word to talk about some of these concepts. So, amount of training. We have in a couple of the standards these three words mentioned, amount of training. So the first one is where it talks about the strategies that you put in place in your organisation. It says, you know, when you put training and assessment strategies in place, you have to consider a number of the things, one of which is the amount of training that you're going to provide to the people who engage with your organisation. And there are some links made from this concept through to the AQF, the Australian Qualifications Framework, which was, when it was re-released, actually included some times, some hour values that sat at qualification level. And they called that in the AQF the volume of learning. And the volume of learning in the AQF is about all of the training things that you would do, all of the practice that you would do, all of the assessment that you would do to actually achieve some qualification outcomes. And those time frames sat at each of the qualification levels. Well, those things that we would engage in to learn, so training that I might do with you in a face-to-face mode, or training that I might really undertake by myself in a self-paced mode, is really what this amount of training is talking about. So saying, how are you going to structure things for me as a learner so that I have enough time to actually achieve the outcomes that I'm supposed to achieve at a qualification level? So that's quite easy for us to look at it at a qualification level, and the regulators have put in their users guides some information about those hour levels. But there's also a statement in there that says we have to take these things into consideration when we're trying to decide the amount of training. So we have to take into account the existing knowledge and skills and experience of whoever it is we're offering to, the cohort that we're offering to, what that mode of delivery might be. And if we're not dealing with a full qualification, what are we actually dealing with in terms of that skill set? What do they need? How much time do they need in terms of a skill set, or potentially even a single unit of competency, to enable them to have that breadth and depth of knowledge and skill that is appropriate? So they're asking you to make those decisions very much around the cohort that you have in front of you. So clearly that's going to be different if you have a complete novice as opposed to someone who in fact might already have been in the workplace for a couple of years, as opposed to someone who has a whole lot of experience in a workplace. So there needs to be some kind of evaluation around what do these people already know, what can they already do, and therefore what's the gap in terms of what I have to teach them. When I look at their characteristics as learners, then what do I need to do for them? For example, are they independent learners? Are they highly literate? Very, very different approach that you might take to maybe someone who is not an independent learner, who needs a lot of support to engage in a learning process. So that number that you see in the AQF and that you see in the users' guides from the regulators is not a hard and fast number. It is a guide. It's a guide to give you an idea around about what might be appropriate for a novice. Then you use all of the processes that you already do to figure out who that cohort is, what their needs are, how do I deliver and assess to put that amount of training in place, and then you tell us about that when we come and say to you, why are you doing it like this? What helped you make this decision to do it like this? So you explain the logic behind your decisions.
It's an interesting, the issue of the volume of learning, and when you think of some qualifications like a Cert 3, the volume of learning might be 1 to 2 years, I'll say, in AQF. If an apprentice does the Cert 3, it's mandated to be, on average, 4 years.
4 years.
So there's a big tension in between those interpretations that I think are a bit problematic, really, in the structures of the system.
Yes. So the comment was around when you have a look at our system and you look at a Certificate 3, for example, you know, we can have, you know, you might have a Certificate 3 in business as opposed to maybe a Certificate 3 to become an electrician. And so we have within our system some qualifications that are mandated at a time period for typically 2.5 to 4 years because they're an apprenticeship. Excuse me. We also have some qualifications that sit as traineeships that will be longer. We have qualifications within our system where there are potentially 8 units of competency at a qualification level, and you know, different training package, maybe there's 30 units of competency in a qualification at the same level. That's why that number's a guide, because we don't have a hard and fast structure that we can work within. It's important to remember with the AQF that it's, you know, it's about the depth, breadth, the complexity of someone's knowledge and skill and how they apply that at a qualification level. Now, as they have taken that and written the training packages, then, you know, we are dealing with someone's interpretation of that and how they have broken up the jobs really into those units of competency. And I think you really have to be a little bit pragmatic and use, I don't really like to use the word common sense, maybe we should say uncommon sense. Let's use some uncommon sense when we look at this. Because you can't, you know, we're not going to be able to say it's X number of hours for a unit. It's just not going to make sense. So we have to take these things into consideration, use those numbers as a guide and a guide only. And of course, for those of you who work with public fund, it's got nothing to do with your nominal hours, which makes it even nicer.
Yeah, sorry, asking from a kind of systems point of view, if we're developing systems for RTOs, one thing we might want to do is to create something like a volume of learning calculator. Now, in order to do that, we have to know what the parameters are and what the weighting is in each of those situations, so that the RTO can plug in the actual figures that are required, you know, the parameters of the volume of learning. Where would a business like ours find that sort of information, those parameters required for an RTO to make decisions on that result in that figure, which is the volume of learning?
Yes. Okay, so the question was, if you wanted to develop some kind of calculator around volume of learning, where would we find the parameters to do that? I would say you won't, actually. Yes, I would say you won't. I'm sorry. Because there are just too many variables. And they're just the only place, even within the AQF itself, at a qualification level, you know, some of those, Certificate 4 level is a good example. It talks about the volume of learning as being 6 months to 2 years. So, you know, where do you fit in that scale? There just isn't the kind of precise specification that you would probably need to enable that to happen.
Yeah, the other option is you create a set of parameters which are relevant, you know, because there's no kind of like hard and fast rules about each parameter, but you list the parameters and maybe allow the RTO to enter values against each parameter, and then they can provide a justification for why they've selected that value, and then that calculates the
I feel extremely uncomfortable about that. Yes, yes.
I'm just thinking, has anyone heard about the researcher Shonts, and he talks about Shonts' swamp in relation to education? And he says the trouble is you can't make that sort of linear judgment, which is about calculated, which is linear, where you've got all of the variables and they're all nice and clean and defined. You can't use that in education because that's for the high ground. We're in the swamp, the murky ground in the swamp, and those variables aren't that clearly defined, so therefore something like a calculator isn't useful.
So could you hear the comments down at the back? Yes? No? Okay. So Viv was, Viv was saying that there's some research that talks about education as a swamp. And that in fact a lot of the things that we would use where we might create a linear type approach is the kind of thing that we might have in a calculator, for example, that doesn't work well in the swamp. That in fact that's for something where we've got a nice paved road that we can walk along, but in the swamp, you know, it might not be as appropriate. Anyone else want to ask a question or make comment? Kathy, do you want to add anything? No? No? Okay. No other questions or comments about amount of training? Okay. So I think this is where I'm supposed to put my flak jacket on for this one.
full combat kit.
Yeah. Yes. I did have full combat kit at one stage. Yes. So for those of you who don't know, I used to be in the military. Not anymore. I do wish I had that Kevlar vest now, though. They took it off me. Okay, so validation. We have always had a concept called validation. Sometimes we have even used the word moderation, and we've had books that have been about moderation and validation. And fundamentally, when we've talked about validation, validation is a quality review process. It still is. It's still a quality review process. What they have done when they've looked at this concept and written the definition into the standards, though, is they've kind of incorporated what we've always talked about as moderation into the definition of validation. So they now talk about us having a look at the systems and processes that we use to improve our assessment practice, but also for us within that validation to have a look at the judgments that we make, and we've always called that moderation. It's now included in the concept of validation. What they have done in these standards is they've said, well, we're going to tell you how much of it you're going to do, and we're going to tell you who's going to be involved in doing that, and we're going to tell you that you have to have this plan in place to do it. So there's this 5-year time frame in which we're now looking at validating the training products that sit on our scope as RTOs. So when we're talking about a training product, we're talking about a unit of competency. And when we think about validation, there have always been things that we do before we use the materials. A very common process, one that makes my blood run cold, but it's very valuable, is mapping. So we've always had some kind of check and balance process that we've used before we use assessment tools. And we check that we make sure that we've covered all of the parts of the unit of competency. And we've always had some processes that we've put in place after the fact where we've checked to see whether what we did worked as we intended it to. Now that hasn't changed. So within these standards, it still talks about the fact you have to make sure you've got a valid assessment. It talks about the principles of assessment: valid, reliable, fair and flexible. So those things that you've always done beforehand about making sure that those tools are valid. No change. Then we talk about what we do afterwards, and I guess this is where they have said, okay, you have to make sure you validate everything in the 5-year period. 50% of it has to be in the first 3 years. And when you're doing that, you have to make sure that you are using a statistically valid random sample. So how do we decide what that is? Well, the regulators are putting out some guidance for us in fact sheets and in their users' guides, which is very helpful. So we're talking about getting within the assessments that you have done on a unit to get a number of those that are going to enable you to confidently say that if I've looked at these judgments that have been made, they are representative of the judgments as a whole on that unit, and I can be satisfied and it's safe to say that if I've made good judgments there, the rest of the judgments are going to be good as well. Okay. So what is that magical number? You're going to get the politician's answer. There is no one hard and fast number. You have to look at the assessments that you have done. Think about things such as how many assessors are we actually talking about in here? Would we have picked a sample that would enable us to look across the assessors, or is it a single assessor? Would we have in our sample things that show the different methodologies that we've used? So for example, if you've made assessment judgments based on a learning and assessment pathway, some that have been based on an RPL pathway, you'd want to make sure you had both of those in your sample because there's potentially different risks associated with those decisions. So you've got to make sure that you've got enough to make that judgment that the decisions are accurate and representative of the group of decisions related to that unit. So there are calculators that have been offered which would give you a roundabout idea of the number. And at the moment, that's the guidance that we've got around that.
I needed your jacket before because I just ran the validation session before you. They were very kind. But the question that came up initially was about the evidence and whether or not we're actually looking at, or what do you, and I guess this is your perspective, do we bring the evidence that the students have completed, or is it suffice to bring a checklist or an assessment record, or what constitutes that evidence for you then to be able to make that judgment?
Okay, so the question is, when we're doing that validation, what do we actually bring to the validation in terms of evidence? So most of us will have some kind of checklist or record that we use to record the judgment that we make. So my question would be, how do we check the judgment if we don't look at the evidence that the judgment was based on? Because if I'm simply looking at, and I know some of you actually do a much better thing than this, but some of you also have checklists that are just rows of ticks and there's nothing else on it. How could I check a judgment if I'm looking at a row of ticks on a piece of paper? And that's in essence what the standard's asking you to do. It's asking you to check the judgment that's been made. That's why they have specified that the person who does the validation's got to have the same qualifications basically, or the team of people that does the validation. Got to have the same qualifications as the assessor in the first place because they want you to check the evidence.
So then the question came up, well, what if it is an observation and I'm not going to video every one of my students doing that, so are they wanting us to then table 50 videos in order for us to then check that their judgment that they made against that observation check? That's the question.
And your problem with that is? How impractical can that possibly be?
Yeah.
So potentially some of the things that we have done and used as very traditional moderation methods before in our very recent past might not be as effective for some of those things. So we might actually need to think outside the box in terms of how we actually collect this evidence, and have had some thinking around how we might do this, and that thinking is represented in the plan so that we're using the right methods to collect the sample that we need to enable us to actually do the validation when it comes to looking at the evidence.
And the videos aren't that unrealistic now. Spy glasses, stick your iPad up in the corner of the room, you know, you can store the data easily, you know.
So I think it depends.
Which environment?
Yes, that's right. And you've made, Viv's comment was, you know, the video is not unrealistic. I mean, the reality is every one of us could probably pull out a phone and shoot video. It's pretty easy these days, and there are other things as well, but certain environments that's completely inappropriate.
Especially if your assessment's 6 hours long.
Yes, yes. So sometimes you can have longer assessments. So, I mean, the reality is you're actually going to have to think long and hard about how to do this. So when they're talking about putting this validation plan in place, they're asking you to have thought about all of those kinds of things before you're doing it. Yvette?
Claire, sorry. Mandy from Private RTO has asked, what is the error percentage and how is it to be determined? It was also asked in Renee's session as well.
It is. It is. ASQA has put out a fact sheet where they have talked about when you're trying to calculate the sample that there are some things that you take into account, one of which is error percentage. And they have put a nominal figure on there as a guide for you to work from, and a little bit of guidance around how you might decide to alter that error figure. That's the only information that we have at the moment around that. It's a concept that has been put out by ASQA. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy, but we're not going to do the same thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So TAC is not going to put out that information in their information. It's something that ASQA is using as a guide to you. Any further clarification, Yvette?
Sorry, she's just responded with there should not be any errors in competency-based training. She thought the percentage shouldn't come into it at all.
Well, okay, so that information sits in that ASQA fact sheet, and maybe feedback to ASQA about that might be the most appropriate way to pursue that. Okay, any other questions or comments? Yes.
I'm just struggling on the whole thing. If observation is the most appropriate way of assessing someone, like I'm in a classroom watching an EA student in action, I'm not going to be filming them in the classroom for an hour while I'm watching them. I just really struggle with the whole concept of the whole thing, really.
Yes. Okay, so the comment was...
Thought it through all of the consequences of what they've decided.
Yes. So the question was, or the comment really is, you know, if I'm in a classroom watching a student, I might not necessarily be going to be videoing them. That might not be appropriate, but observation might be the best way to do that. And, you know, have we really thought through all of the consequences of these standards? So I think I want to address that in two parts. One about the consequences and thinking that through, and the other one about how you might do that. So, you know, traditionally when we've done moderating type activities, what we do is we bring things to a meeting. So what I'm saying is that methodology, bringing to a meeting, might not be the best methodology. For example, what about if you looked at something more like an assessment panel or something like that where 2 people were watching. Now, I know there's a cost involved with that. So is there also a cost involved with putting everyone in a room as well? But potentially that meeting is not the best way to do it. So there used to, well, it's still out there, you can still access it. There was a book about learning and assessment strategies, and it's really old now, but the concept is exactly the same. A blue and orange book that was put out, I think, by Anta way back in the dark ages. And in there, they've got a table. They've got a whole lot of different types of activities that RTOs typically, or training organisations typically do. And they look at how you could adapt those methodologies to look at different parts of your assessment processes. And potentially having a look at that table might also give you some ideas around how maybe we could use some other processes for moderating type activities rather than our traditional sit around the table. Because you're right, you know, it's not appropriate for every sector, and it's not appropriate or potentially not the best way to have a look at some of that information. The second part of the question about thinking about the consequences of things. There's no doubt, I'm trying to be very politically correct here, there's no doubt that there's some unintended consequences, I think, in what we're going to be doing. And my understanding is that the regulators have certainly, because they don't own the standards, they're just the implementers of them. They have highlighted some of those things. They know some of those things are problematic. And I think what you might find is as we go through that process of like starting, well, we have started to do audits, so as we get more feedback from audits through that process, then, you know, potentially there'll be some things or some guidance from the regulators about what they're expecting that might make the standards a little, well, maybe more practical. Yes.
Well, that's the irony.
Yes, yes. Okay. Now, so we've talked about how much. So we're still looking at everything. We're looking at before and after processes. Your scope basically sits in a 5-year plan where you decide when you're going to look at particular things. You should fundamentally be using some kind of risk-based approach to decide what you're going to look at when. And I mean, you might look at some of your units of competency more than once in the 5-year process. In fact, I would be stunned if you didn't, because there are some things that are just naturally higher risk than others. So, and also with the churn of units that we have, the rate of change in the units, potentially you might have a unit come up a few times within that 5 years. But then it's thinking about who can actually be involved. So if you have actually made the judgment of competence, if I've signed on the line, so I've signed my name saying you're competent, then I can't be the one that says this is a valid judgment. So I might be involved loosely in the process, providing some information to you about how things went, how things happened, but that decision about whether a valid judgment has been made, I cannot be involved with, and that decision is based on that evidence that's provided to you. So if I said, oh, well, I saw Viv do this, that and the other, and she was really good, and I've known her from here, and blah, 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 none of that can be considered in the validation process, because fundamentally it's hearsay. All right, you're looking at the evidence that's presented to you that the RTO has kept as evidence to support the judgment that they've made. So we're looking for someone who's got that training and assessment qualification, someone who is vocationally competent, someone who is industry current, and if we can't have all of those in one person, then we put a team of people together that encompass those things. Okay. Not including the person who made the judgment. Well, because no, they can't, no. That's right. That's right. So, any other questions or comments about validation? Yes.
So, say as an RTO, I find another like-minded RTO with those same qualifications and industry experience, and we're working together and we're doing our validation, and that's working okay. We have to obviously trust that they've got that vocational competence, that they're doing a great job as an RTO. Do we have to have a look at their staff profiles to make sure that they've got all those qualifications and the vocational currency and the industry knowledge? Is that part of that process to make sure that that's validated?
So the question is, if you are working with another RTO and we're using their staff to help in the validation process, would you as the RTO check that the staff that have come from that other RTO are actually vocationally competent, industry current, blah, blah, blah? Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
One of the major problems in the sport and outdoor recreation is actually having a vocationally competent instructor level, like canoeing, powerboating and those type of things.
Yep.
They are not vet orientated, but they do come from a peak body. Is that sufficient to say that they are qualified?
There might be vocation.
Yes. So the comment.
I'm just putting it
Yes.
out as the devil's advocate.
Yes. Thank you. I knew it was Friday in my mind. So, the comment was around where you have an industry area, sport and recreation, for example, where some of the things, so for example, power boating or canoeing, you know, it's very much, or there's a lot of guidance put out from a peak body. Can we use those peak body people to be in that process? Yes, you can use them in the process, but you have to make sure they're vocationally competent. That means that you establish in some way that they have the knowledge and skills that they need to, but then you've still got to have those other things that the standard says, yes.
Yeah. But there is a shortcoming in that area.
Yeah, yeah. And there are, yes, absolutely. And there are times when you are going to have to use people from industry and establish that. I'm talking to an RTO last week where they work in a very, very specialised area, and they did have an industry person working with them, and that person had the training and assessment qualification, and he was the only person in Australia, and he's gone overseas now and doesn't work with them anymore. So what do they do now? So the reality is they can have their trainers and assessors involved in the process for the training and assessment part of it, but they're going to have to source other people from industry to make up that skill set that the standard says they have to have. Yes. Any other questions or comments about validation? Oh, I got off easy. Okay, so let's open it up more generally now. These standards that we're working with, any questions or comments about any other parts of the standards? Yes?
Just thinking about the observation, so you take a second person along with you, but you actually have to have a third person along because the person who's actually making the judgment can't be involved in. Is that right?
You could still have, yeah. So, exactly. Yes.
So you only need one person.
As long as
So-
they've got the cert for and they're industry competent.
So one person is adequate in the validation.
Yeah, so when we talk about validation, so the question was, you know, like how many people would we really have to take along? If we were looking at observations and we had to bring someone else along to have a look at that observation, wouldn't we have to bring more people? And it depends. So the standard just says you're vocationally competent, you've got a TAE and you're industry current. Now, the ideal situation is we have all of that vested in one person. Sometimes we're not going to be able to do that, and there might need to be 2 people or potentially even more. And a lot of organisations I have heard have been talking about putting panels together for validation. Well, that's not mentioned in the standards. They just say these are the qualities that that person who validates has to have. How you make that up is up to you.
Because in the past we've always had like a validation team, never just
Yeah.
one person.
Yeah, and yeah, lots of organisations have had validation teams, and they might still choose to do that, as long as we get that mix of those three things in there.
Not practical for an observation, maybe.
Potentially not, yes. Yes.
I'm curious about how this affects the delivery in schools, the certificate 1, 2 and 3 about the volume of learning.
Yes.
What's the, I don't know, the more precise, I'm just, how it's going to be very hard for schools, especially with the changes in the waste that's come through. Cert 3 is worth far more points than Cert 2. A lot of schools are delivering each in 1 year. Can a Cert 3 be used to map through to back learning for a Cert 3 so that none of the hours that are delivered can still take place in 12 months?
Yeah, so the question is around how does the volume of learning impact on the delivery, the VET delivery in schools? And it's a very good question, because typically they're a group of novice learners. And depending on how the school is dealing with it, sometimes their VET delivery is simply 4 periods in the week. Sometimes they are fully engaged in the VET qualification as well. So if I'm going to put my hard and fast hat on, I would say that you need to take into account those same criteria. We wouldn't differentiate them from any other group. I acknowledge that you've got two systems that are trying to fit together, that they don't necessarily fit together, or they're going to have some challenges, maybe significant, in fitting together. From this VET point of view, when I look at it, I'm going to say, who's the cohort? What qualification are they doing? What knowledge and skill do they already have? How have you set up a program that's going to address that? And I'm just going to apply those rules that we talked about earlier to that system.
So Cert 2 could be used as the background of the learning, the volume level of learning to go for Cert 3, like it's in media, I'm thinking about. Is it global histories, media course, and then it goes,
So are you allowed to carry those you're allowed to carry some of those Cert 2 units in as electives?
Not, some of the electives are transferable, but it's more that learning, that aspect that you spent 12 months already learning. Can that be part of the justification?
Well, only if it's relevant to the units that are in the Certificate 3. And sometimes there will be, and sometimes there won't be. Yvette.
Sorry, having to take earphones out so I'm not hearing myself 3 times. Kimberley Training Institute would like to know, why did you make the comment, my blood boils, in relation to mapping, Claire?
Oh, because I don't like doing it.
That's the only reason.
Yes. I just don't like doing it. In fact, I pay somebody to do it for me. I just like it so much. But as I said, yes, my blood boils with that, but it is a really valuable process. But you really need to be a super details person to do it. You need to be a details person, and that's not me. That's not my natural way of thinking, yes. So I pay a details person to do it, Kimberley Training Institute, and then I look at the work that they've done and I check that, yeah. So I just believe you give work to people who have a strength in the area, and it's not mine. Any other questions? Generally? Yeah.
It was more of a comment, really,
Yeah.
about that issue about the volume of learning in schools. We do to our pre-apprenticeship to school students and also to adults, the same qualification, Cert 2, but it's really obvious when you deal with mature age people entering, because of their work placement, they would have worked in trade areas or something quite often. The volume of learning they require, they'll do it in maybe a third of the time. So the individuals can vary quite a lot, but a lot of people might do it in a third of the time. The volume of learning for them to develop all the requirements for the pre-apprenticeship and then go on to a trade is maybe a third on average that it would be with the school-based. I suppose that's might be a useful guide. In
Yeah.
that case.
Yeah, so the comment is around is when you compare, and you're right, like often the qualifications might be offered to people who have quite a lot of workplace experience and some who have none and very little life experience too when it comes to some of the people who are engaging in the waste certificate. And in those circumstances, the amount of training that's needed is vastly different simply because of the characteristics of the cohort. And, you know, that is what this standard is aiming at. It's making sure that you actually put a strategy in place that is appropriate for the cohort that you're offering to. We don't want sausage machines pumping out people who actually can't do the job. And, you know, let's be upfront about it. That is the feedback that the sector is getting, is that you're putting people out there with qualifications who cannot do the jobs. So, you know, when we do that, this is the result. Yes?
I think all of us have new training packages come out or coming in.
Yes,
So
yes.
we're kind of looking at developing a new quals. Do we, because I believe we get audited on these new standards and training assessment strategies, do we have to spend a lot of time on the units that we're currently delivering and putting all these processes up based on that to pass this audit, or is there some flexibility in that we're going to be focusing on the new training packages? What helps the flexibility with that?
I might throw that one to you, Kathy. So,
Well, I mean, we do certificate 3 in aged care is one of them, and that's a new qualification, and we're about to go into project base, about developing that. We'd like to start delivering that as soon as possible. But obviously, to get the validation and all that going, I'll have to do schedules and look at all the units of competency that we're delivering now, and anything that's behind that we need to do. Should we be doing both simultaneously? Is that what we're going to get audited on, or like the training packages right now that we're delivering? Because I've heard that it might be the audit soon. I heard there might be some audits soon, that's all.
Look, we look at it from an outcomes basis as well. If you've got students going through, they deserve the same quality as the new students. And that's the bottom line. That's political, isn't it?
it is very good.
But that's about it. I mean, if you're the student in your class now, you want the same rigour as your next cohort.
Yeah, sure.
And, you know, and that I guess that's also an individual business decision. You know, you have to look at the risk to your business and the quality of what you're offering to your students and make a decision about what approach you're going to take. Yep.
Wouldn't be fully developed on the new, that would just be ridiculous. But progressing forwards,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it does help, doesn't it?
Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. So we've got 3 minutes. I'm not going to sing for you. And trust me, you're very lucky I'm not going to do that. But what I would like to finish up by saying is, you know, really these new standards for us are a huge opportunity. Yes, there's some detail in there that you look at and you think, oh my goodness, what were they thinking of when they were thinking about that? But if you have a look at what the intent of these standards are, and they all have a context statement in where they're telling you what the intent is, what they're trying to get to. Think about it strategically in your business. Is it right for my business? Am I doing what I need to do to deliver quality training and assessment to my students? It's going to be all right. They have not introduced new things conceptually. It's the same concepts we're used to working with. There is simply a level of refinement that goes with that potentially will be more helpful to us as training organisations, but also as regulators, in that we have that very clear specification in terms of what we're looking for, and we're looking for it to work. Okay, so whatever you say you're going to do, we have to make sure it works. Okay. So thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate you coming, including those people who have joined us online. And I wish you all the best with your implementation of these new standards, and you never know, we might see you out there soon with a different hat on.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.